Welcome to Jacobin Talks. My name is Pablo Peluca, and I will be talking today with Branko Milanović about, among other things, his new book, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. Branko Milanović is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia. He served as a lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years. He has been affiliated with the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, Oxford, and the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. He has also written many influential and award-winning books, such as Worlds Apart, Measuring International and Global Inequality from 2005, The Haves and the Have-Nots, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Global Inequality, published in 2010, Global Inequality, A New Approach for the Age of Globalization, also from 2010, and of course, Capitalism Alone. Professor Milanović, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to obviously see you and to talk for the Jacobin.
Great. I will start with the first question. After your book, Global Inequality, which was a major success, you transitioned to a book that examines some of the fundamentals of capitalism. It is actually curious that Thomas Piketty also went through a similar path, launching Capital and Ideology. Do you think there is a reason for this transition from inequality to an encompassing explanation of capitalism? What was your motivation when you started with the Capitalism Alone project?
Yeah, it is a good question. Let me try to explain it. Of course, I was always interested very much in empirical studies of capitalism, actually, since I was at university. And basically, some of the things that I'm working now are essentially things that I really wish I had worked like 40 years ago, because that was something that I really, for example, the relations between different types of income, capital versus labor, and how they empirically actually the interplay within society, something that I really was interested in. But in those days, you actually didn't even have data like that. But to answer your question very sort of clearly, let me put it like that. First, of course, after Piketty's book, Piketty had one great sort of contribution, which was bringing back sort of the study of capital and the importance of capital income in income distribution. It has been sort of expurged from income inequality for a very long time. And then when I was actually reading and studying his book and then writing a couple of papers after that, the basic idea, which is actually in the current book, but which was already in one paper that I published before, was to look at how the rising capital share with differential rates of return to depending on the amount of capital that you had, and the very fact that capital owners are generally represented at the top of income distribution, sort of leads to a quasi-automatic transmission into interpersonal inequality. So people would realize then that it's really sort of an attempt to combine factorial income distribution with interpersonal income inequality. And then on top of that, I started really noticing, because that was actually something new in this book, the fact that you have more and more households, what I call which are homoplutic, which means that people have high capital and labor income, and they are generally at the top of the income distribution. And then the last point was that these kind of advantages, ownership of capital and labor, assortative mating, where you marry actually people of the same income level or education level or social status, then lead to intergenerational transmission of inequality. So basically all that I'm saying now is really the ideas that totally fashion the chapter 2, which then of course leads to the question of the formation of a self-sustaining elite and so on. So that was my pathway to that chapter. And actually, I think it opens up some of the issues. Maybe we'll talk more about that later, but about the difficulties with some of these things which increase inequality, but they are not in themselves either controllable or bad. For example, if you marry more similar people, there is nothing wrong with it. But the fact is that they actually, when they do that, they are much more likely, first, to be rich, secondly, to transmit all these advantages to children and to create some kind of a new aristocracy, if you will. So this is, for example, an issue. And now to end this question, which might be also interesting, is the chapter 3, which actually which deals with China. Originally, in my mind, started as an entirely separate book, because the question that was puzzling me is, what was the global historical role of communism? And if you look at that chapter, of course, the first part of that chapter is about that. And then, of course, it continues with China, which is, of course, the best exemplar of that whole discussion. So that the chapter 3 really basically came, as I said, from that interest. And originally, I thought really I would just write an entire book only on that. But as it turned out, maybe it was too ambitious. So I'm actually quite happy to have combined it with the role of China.
As you know, I'm a historian, I'm not an economist, so I would like to have a kind of a historical question here. What were the main characteristics of the so-called golden age of post-war capitalism, and why do you think the welfare state was able to guarantee both a reduction of inequality and economic growth? And therefore, what was, if you like the term, I'm not sure, what was the neoliberal revolution?
You know, the main characteristics that people obviously now emphasize a lot was the ability of West European countries and the United States to at the same time have high rates of growth and to reduce income inequality. Now, if you pose the question like that, there is no doubt that both of these statements are true. You know, West European countries had really, after 1945, until probably what they call the in French les 30 glorieuses, like until 75, actually practically until the oil crisis, they had rates of growth about 4 to 5%. So that was something really absolutely new. You know, we didn't have rates of growth of that size in the past. Secondly, inequality did actually decline also very significantly. So both of these statements, I think, are true. I'll come to a minute like why that might happen. But, you know, one should little bit be cautious, and I'm you know, I lived through that period. We should not sort of over embellish that period. The period had many difficult parts. I mean, when I mentioned to people that, you know, during that period, France was twice on the edge of the civil war, you know, with the Algerian crisis and resistance and Organisation Armée Secrète, which was actually doing lots of terrorist attacks in France, including several attempted assassination of de Gaulle. You know, some of them people might remember that was a fictionalized story, obviously, of the Jackal, but they were very similar stories like that. And then also during 1968. So then, of course, you can say, well, if it was such a great period, how did we have colonels in Greece? How did we have Franco in Spain? How did we have Portugal? How did we have France on the edge of the Civil War? How did we have Baader-Meinhof? How did we have the Italian, what is the name? It's not Red Army fraction, that was the Baader-Meinhof, but the Italian equivalent. So there were really many other things, you know, so one should not believe that we lived in some kind of a utopia or Arcadia. But the two facts, actually high growth and reduction of inequality, are true. Now, how did it happen? You know, there are, of course, many discussions of that. I think the basic story is that you had, for the high growth, you had a catch up because of the effect of World War II, so that actually many of these countries, take Germany, for example, they were destroyed physically and the capital was destroyed. But human ability, skills, and all of that, they were there. Ability to organize production was there. So you actually had a huge amount of capital, labor, human capital and labor that had to be put to work, and under the proper conditions it was. Then when it comes to the reduction of inequality, I think what played a role was the realization essentially of the capitalist class, or what people call the bourgeois bloc of parties, that they really had to actually be very careful lest they want to be basically overthrown. People should remember that, like, for example, 1947, French communists were in the government. They were quite a powerful party, likewise in Belgium. And then in Italy in 1973, I believe they became the largest party also. So they were actually basically pushing the sort of right-wing or bourgeois parties to be much more conciliatory, because they actually wanted, obviously, to preserve capitalism, and there was a threat to it. And then, likewise, there was a very strong position of the socialist and communist parties and link with the trade unions. And on top of that, you had a Fordist system of production where actually you could organize workers, and there was a long history of worker organization in Western Europe. So essentially, all these factors made sort of capitalist class or leaders and so on much more likely to entertain the ideas which were social democratic or welfare state like, and I'm of course here emphasizing Germany, France, Italy, but obviously similar process, not exactly the same, happened in the Nordic countries. So that was my explanation for these two developments that happened. And then what was the neoliberal turn? I will just very briefly say that because it's already too long, but I think there was a dissatisfaction with the role of the welfare state and slow growth, especially after the oil crisis. And I think Margaret Thatcher really caught the mood very well then by essentially saying, look, if we want to grow faster, we have to get rid of all these things which are impeding us. So the welfare state, which was really perceived very, very favorably in the 60s, then started being perceived as some kind of a drag on economic growth in the late 70s with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So that was a dramatic change. It is maybe slightly more dramatic in language than in reality, because if you look at the size of the welfare state today and then, it has not really changed that much. It has become less redistributive, but they were not able to kind of overturn the welfare state in the way that they originally sort of claimed.
Let's move a bit to talk about socialism. In Capitalism alone, you state that socialism has worked mostly in poor, backward, and colonized societies to foster development. You just talk about China. Is that road to development still open, or did globalization and global change of value cancel that possibility? And also, why you mentioned the dependentistas from Latin America? Why were the Latin American dependentistas, the dependency theory, late, as you said in your book?
Okay, so there are several questions there. So if I forget one of them, please remind me. But
sure.
The first point is about the general or global historical role of communism, in the sense that I actually, to be very brief on that, my argument was that that was obviously something which was not anticipated, nor the people who participated in that planned to do this. But I think what turned out to be is that actually communist parties were uniquely well placed to effect two revolutions. One is to liberate the countries from the foreign interference. That was actually to decolonize the countries. Even the countries like China, which were not formally colonized, but of course had many of the aspects of a colony. Simply, I mean, when one realizes that, for example, custom duties were collected by foreigners, and essentially the economic policy was dictated by foreigners. There was extraterritoriality for foreign citizens and so on. And then the second point was actually to end a number of pseudo or quasi or real feudal practices, including the role of landlords, including the usury situation of women, and things of that, education to the people. So these are really the two objectives, and which I think they did. And they laid the basis, which I mentioned in my book, to play a functionally very similar role that the bourgeoisie played in the West. Of course, the difference wasn't in the West. They didn't have the liberation movement since they were independent states. But when I look at the Chinese experience, or Vietnamese, or actually others, I mentioned about 12 countries in that in that chapter, including Algeria, for example, or Rwanda, or Ethiopia. You had really always this combination of national independence movement and sort of anti-feudal or restrictions or elimination of feudal impediments to growth. So I think this is what the communist movements did, and then unbeknown to them, they actually set the basis for the development of indigenous or autochthonous capitalism as it happened in China and Vietnam. So that was kind of a sort of a global historical role of communism. But there is much more to that, I discussed, but I will just mention it to the reader, discuss the role of the Comintern in the 1920s and how unusual there was this decision to actually ally yourself even with bourgeois parties in the capital, in the colonized countries, which was really not part of the necessary Marxist textbook. So that was the global role. Now, you asked me the question, now, is this road open now? I don't think so. And the reason why is that I think because there were historical conditions then, as I explained, which really required sort of feudalism plus colonization. So we don't have these conditions anymore. Feudal type of relationships might exist somewhere at the edges of the sort of development. And on the other hand, we don't really have formal or even informal colonies of the old fashion. We might have countries that depend very much on what the lenders or what the different international organizations would do, like for example Argentina, which had problems with the IMF, with the World Bank and the others, but this is not a typical or not even closely to typical colonial relationship. So I think that was not open. Now, the last question about the Latin American structuralists is an interesting one, and I thought of that, and I think it needs to be further developed by others who know much better than. I think what actually happened with them, why I said they came late, because had they come earlier, let's suppose in the 1920s, I think they would have actually gone much more to the left. But they came in the 1960s, where there was always disenchantment with the socialist experiment or socialist system as such, because of Stalinism and because of the enormous costs that were actually clearly borne by the people in those countries. So they actually kind of, in my opinion, came in that sense too late. Obviously, that the path that I was mentioning before with colonialism and anti-feudalism was the path that was close to them because Latin America became independent in 1820s. So they could not replay 1960s what happened like 150 years ago. So that's what I meant, And I think it raises other issues I just want to mention for people who might want to study that in the future. I was asked, for example, by several people, can Turkey fit that mold? And, I think it's an interesting question. I personally don't think, because Turkey was not colonized, but there are certain elements at the weak point of Turkey before World War I, which actually had semi-colonial position, despite the fact that Turkey itself was a colonizer in the Middle East. So I think there are many interesting issues there. And as you know, Turkey with Ataturk obviously had a very strong political, somewhat leftist actually movement, which was not that similar from, for example, dissimilar for Kuomintang, KMT, or in China. So there are many, I think, interesting questions that people can study.
It's interesting. You know that the dependentistas were arguing in the 60s if Latin America was still like under a kind of feudal system or a capitalist system. So they were actually debating this stuff during those years. So in the opening of Capitalism Alone, you say, capitalism has been remarkably successful in imparting its objectives to people, prompting or persuading them to adopt its goals, and thus achieving an extraordinary concordance between what capitalism requires for its expansion and people's ideas, desires, and values. Why was capitalism so successful?
That's a difficult question. Let me first say that, of course, what I meant by this is the following, and not to repeat everything that you said, but I think what is needed for the success of any system is, and of course you historians and political philosophers know that there should be a coincidence, a concordance between the needs of the system to spread and the values that people hold. And it goes back even to Plato when he talks about four different imperfect systems, democracy, tyranny, oligarchy, temarchy, and says each of them has one type of man, which is the dominant type of man, and which actually sort of reflects the values of the system. So I think the same was true in capitalism. You need profit and in order to grow. So without profit, you will not have growth of capitalism. But you also have, at the personal level, you have to have the value system that puts really wealth acquisition at the top, because it is only with this wealth acquisition to the top that you can actually then either become a consumer or an investor or a worker and actually enhance further the objectives of the system. So I think the two of them are very well attuned, and I think they are actually becoming much more attuned now as capitalism is becoming much more prevalent and enters our private sphere. Now, why was it so successful? That's a really big question, because it leads us to two different possibilities. One, we can say, well, doesn't it show that capitalism is a natural system? Because maybe these innate desires that we want to be the richest, the strongest, the dominant ones are really something innate, inherent to human nature. So capitalism is really a system which has really best approximated human nature. I'm against that view, because I think that actually capitalism, like any other system, is a historical system. And so there is nothing which is sort of forever and nor totally representing our innate needs. I think that actually what it happened is that it has been able to concord quite well with our historical needs now. And they create these needs, which I don't use in a pejorative sense, because I think that all needs are created, other than the very elementary needs. Everything else is socially created. So it has created that. We actually feel comfortable with that, but it doesn't mean that a different system, a different organization of production, greater abundance of goods, maybe greater leisure time, maybe the fact that the labor would become a dominant factor of production in the sense that it would be scarce and capital would be abundant, it doesn't mean that our needs may not change. So in that sense, I'm of the opinion that we actually have to take that as a historical category, but I cannot, like nobody can, obviously tell you whether it would actually change. Obviously, it would change by small steps, but whether it would change in a century, 2 or 5, but to believe that it would remain like this forever, I think it's really totally a historical, People believed in Roman Empire that it would last forever, it would never change. People believed that slavery would be forever, so all of that changed. So I don't think that we are any smarter than people who lived before us.
I hope so too. So the next question is, what are the connections between, it's something that you talk about a lot about in your book, but what are the connections between capitalism and what we call liberal democracy? In the book, you define two different kinds of capitalisms still working today, and liberal meritocratic capitalism and political capitalism. What are the main differences, briefly, for our audience?
I'm glad about this question, and I think maybe I should have written more about this, because first, I think many people wrongly, and I think it's a result basically of a propaganda machinery in the last 30 years, they basically identify capitalism with liberal political system. And if you simply go and, for example, take Polity 4, and or some other sort of democracy database, and then kind of put together how many country years, you had capitalist regimes, capitalist societies with non-democratic regimes, you would probably find, even if you go back and say the first capitalist countries are, for example, I suppose the UK in 1815, let's start from that point onward, you would actually probably have less than half of the country years being actually democratic. And even when they were democratic, they were very often, as you know, historically, with very limited franchise, with, of course, the US being, of course, extreme example where you basically had 13% of population being owned by the others, and forget about their right of vote. They actually were treated as machines. So as tools. So when you do that, you actually realize that there is no necessary association at all between capitalism and political democracy. So, that idea is much more of a recent vintage. And even then, for many of the countries that are now democratic, they were not democratic 60 years ago, including, for example, Argentina, which went through this period of military governments. Take Brazil also. I mean, I mentioned already Portugal, Chile, Turkey, Spain, number of countries. So, and let alone countries in Africa or Asia. Let's take Indonesia, which was clearly a capitalist country, but actually was a dictatorship. Take Thailand. I mean, we can go on and on. Or take Germany and Japan before World War II, which obviously were capitalist countries big time, but they were not democratic. So that association, I think, is wrong. I'm sorry, the second question you asked me was about...
was about the differences between political capitalism and this liberal meritocratic kind of capitalism.
Oh, yes. Okay. So then actually one of the reasons that also propelled me to write the book is because I was very much anti-Fukuyamista, if you want to put it like that, believing precisely for the reasons that I just said, that we cannot really put these two things together as something which normally goes together, capitalism and liberal democracy. So then, the argument in my book is essentially that we first cannot put these two things together necessarily, and secondly, what we observe right now, a capitalist, very powerful capitalist country like China and similar countries like that, which are politically different. So when we look at the future, I don't think that we can say, well, one model would really win out and would dominate the entire world. And so, I actually think that the world is way too complicated to be dominated by one single model, which is both economic model and a political model. So that was the objective, one of the objectives of the book. Now, how do they differ? Very briefly, maybe we'll talk more about that, but they differ because, of course, in the political sphere in China, you don't have a democracy, you have one-party system, you have very important role of the state, of the government. I actually talked about the state not being captured by the special interests. And let me just give you an example, which now comes out like 3 days ago. You have probably seen this, the largest IPO in world history that should have happened with Jack Ma and A&T company, and which was stopped like 2 days before the IPO by, actually what was interesting, the meeting was between relatively mid-level government officials from the Regulation Commission and Jack Ma, one of the richest people in the world. That clearly shows you the power of the state. It would be much more difficult to do something like that in the US. If they were to meet Elon Musk or somebody like that, they would not have sent like 2 mid-level officials from the Commerce Department to tell him that he has to shut up and redo all the IPO.
Yeah, doesn't seem likely. The last question from this section is, you have emphasized how the composition, I'm talking about capital and labor, of the super riches, especially in the US, but in the West, broadly speaking, have changed in the last 30 years. Would you mind expanding on this? What were the driving forces explaining this process?
The argument, and this is something that I'm doing like now a couple of papers with different authors, is this argument that I mentioned before of homoplutia, where we have at the top of the income distribution people who are both rich in the space of capital income and labor income. This is a new development. Let me just put it like that. For anybody who has studied classical economics or actually been interested even in sociologically, what did Marx write, what did Adam Smith write, what Ricardo wrote, there was no doubt that they actually implicitly and sometimes even explicitly saw the world divided obviously in classes, in Ricardo, landlords, capitalists, workers, and these three classes were practically non-overlapping. Doesn't mean that no worker was ever, richer than somebody who had some capital. And there were, of course, differentiations between workers. But broadly speaking, there were few capitalists that were actually overtaking landlords in Ricardo in 1817, and there were almost no workers that would overtake by their income capitalists. So really, the functional income distribution determined your position in the interpersonal income distribution. If you were a landlord, you were richer than me. If I was a capitalist, kind of end of story there. But that has really changed with the changing sort of capitalism in the 20th century. And now we have an interesting development, which, as I said, was not noticed before, is that you have at the very top of the income distribution, people who are actually having very large salaries. And I'm not talking about people who get, for example, different stock options. I'm just talking really people who have wage income, large wage income, because they could be CEOs, or they could be really head of the enterprises, or very successful doctors, or extremely successful IT engineers, or whatever. And on the other hand, they either through that, I really don't know because I don't have longitudinal data, either through over a long time, they accumulate large incomes, and then of course they use that income to save and to invest. Or maybe they actually have inherited quite a lot from the parents. I don't know. In any case, they end up with large assets, which actually give them quite a lot of money when they invest it. And they actually have high skills, which give them high labor income. So this is something new. And, for example, in the US data, we see that from 1980 to today, if you take the top 10% by labor and income, about 1/3 now are people who are really in both top 10% by labor and top 10% by capital. So that was not the case in the past. In the past, actually, 1970s, the percentage was 15%, so it has doubled. And we find that in a number of other countries. But countries, and I want to say actually for Latin America, the countries in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil, do not have that overlap, because they are more standard capitalist countries. Big time capitalists are not going to be working, as labor somewhere else. So we see that the difference between differently advanced capitalist nations. And then the question becomes really what happens, and that's actually an interesting question, I think, what happens when you have almost 100% of people who are in the top decile by income, and they are also the top decile as large capitalist owners, and in the top decile by labor. So I think it's a totally new situation. We never had a situation like that in history. And, to some extent, you can say it's an improvement because we don't have association between capital with being rich and labor being poor. But on the other hand, it becomes a society where actually, basically, all the all the assets are in the hands of one group of people. And that group of people transmits these assets to the next generation. So I think it becomes a very interesting question to see whether it may not even lead to a more, how should I say, more segmented or more stratified society than what we have now.
Well, actually, coming back to the question about the triumph of capitalism, that would be one of the good reasons explaining that success in terms of values and spirit and stuff. I would like to move now to the field of economics and to talk a bit about economists, because recently you have questioned how the Nobel Prize has systemically, not recognized the work of economists who do not belong into the canon, let's say. Could you expand on this issue? What contributions or economists do you think have not received enough attention in academia?
What I found striking, and it started with really sort of one small tweet, and then of course people reacted, and then of course I reacted, and so it kind of snowballed. But what I was really surprised when I saw the most recent prize, and of course I read, for example, an excellent book by Avner Offer and Sandstrom about the Nobel factor, which basically sort of lies out the whole history. And the whole history of the Nobel Prize is like when you read the history of rich families. It basically all starts with a crime or plunder or stealing So that the prize is the same. It started actually, as you know, not intentionally to be the Nobel Prize. It originally was the prize given by the Swedish central bank, which was supposed basically to reinforce the independence of the central bank against the social democratic government. So they never had an idea about the Nobel Prize. They just wanted to have a right-wing prize that would actually reinforce their position against the government. Then somebody, I can't remember, in Avner Offer a book it says, came up the idea, let's approach the Nobel Committee. So they approached the Nobel Committee, and actually the committee was against it. But then there was a small detail which is quite revealing. The Central Bank of Sweden gave the Nobel Committee the authorization to invest in some financial instruments which it didn't have the right to invest before. So basically, the Nobel Committee was really, bribed. And of course, the prize itself, the money is given by the Swedish National Bank. So this is the origin. So leaving the origin aside, one thing which actually surprised me was that if you look at actually large developments that we are actually practically witnessing now, we're talking about China. There has never been, after the Industrial Revolution, and including even American sort of expansion, there has never been an event of economic relevance as the rise of China. We are talking more than 1 billion people expanding at the rate of 8% for 40 years. I mean, this is nothing close has happened. So I was saying, okay, well, we are here witnessing that event. We don't have anybody who got the Nobel Prize, not because he understood or she understood that, because really it is a difficult thing to understand. There are different opinions, and so on. But nobody who is studying that. So it's a little bit like you have Adam Smith writing at the origin of the British or Scottish, in this case, or English Industrial Revolution, and you give the prize like to a guy who is in Glasgow deciding of the best way how to sort of receive ships and how many days they should stay there and how they should be charged according to the weight or maybe the value of what they bring. So that's what you say, okay, this is really the most important issue in Glasgow today, so we'll give the prize to a guy who has solved that problem. And then you have Adam Smith discussing sort of the commercial society and the growth of capitalism, and say, well, that's actually neither here nor there, so let's leave this aside. And this is really what we have in the case of China. But then you go further. You then say, okay, the prize was founded in 1968. Communist regimes existed until 1990 practically, so it's actually more than 20 years. There were people, and I mentioned Corney by name, who have actually studied these systems, and they actually opened my eyes at the functioning of this system. But if you have the view of the world that only capitalism is the economics, and everything else is non-economic. So, feudal systems, you don't care. Roman systems or Byzantine or Greece, you don't care. Arab systems, you don't care. China before 1978, you don't care. Then, of course, the only thing which remains for you is the West from last 30 years or 40 years. So if you study that period, that's okay, that's economics. Anything else, which goes with economic history or different economic systems, is just rejected. So that's really weird, because actually if anybody has been able to study and convincingly show the features, for example, of a socialist system, I think this is something which is absolutely a big issue. You had 1/3 of the mankind living under that system. And then I started thinking further. Let me just finish with 2 examples which are also dramatic and which are really the biggest examples, because biggest stories in economics that we have lived through, is the privatization of the assets in formerly socialist countries. Again, people were actually arguing what could be the problems there, but none of those who have argued that got, acknowledged, although it turned out that they have been right. So, that's a huge sort of omission. And then finally, the global financial crisis, because people who were rewarded were people who were basically arguing for financialization, which then proved to be a disaster. And they, of course, did not acknowledge people who were actually, warning against this. So when you put these 4 examples, and we can probably go with more, but look, these are really the biggest stories. China, socialism, transition from socialism to capitalism, and the global financial crisis. So are there any larger stories in the last, 50 years? I don't think there are. And they were totally ignored.
So that takes us to the next question, because the issues you have emphasized have had an impact on the teaching of economics and the education of future economists. How do you think the teaching of economics could or should be improved, and what do you see as a priority?
I don't know that very well because, of course, what I've been teaching that for more than 20 years, but I basically teach my own stuff and I don't interact very much with the departments, and actually I don't even like that, so I'm really totally out of it. I've been, of course, in a number of dissertation committees, but it's different because these are people who work in the areas that I know I'm interested. The situation, I think, is pretty bleak, in my opinion. It is pretty bleak because the economics has really been basically hijacked by a narrow group of people who have this agenda that we just talked about. And this agenda really basically believes that that's the entire economics. So all this I said before, I don't want to repeat. Essentially, they have a view of economics, which is like what we are doing last 30 or 40 years. That's the end of the story. That's what economics is. And of course, they have hijacked the profession. They know each other, they meet with each other, and so on. They are smart people. They do, interesting stuff in that area. And then they essentially are able to impose such, preferences on other people, on the young people, to study what they actually believe are important issues. I'm somewhat optimistic, though, in one area, and this is my area about income inequality, because what is happening there, and that's the part that I'm optimistic, is that you had a much greater interest for all these issues that we know, the income inequality, heterogeneity in outcomes and all of that. And on the other hand, we have been really lucky that at the same time, there was a huge expansion of data. So in my area, I'm very, very optimistic because I think many young people are interested in those issues and they have the means to study them, because the big data has really opened up enormous ability to study, which we didn't have in the past. And that has actually been that coincided with increased interest of many young people into inequality and what I would call generally heterogeneity of outcomes. Because so long as we had this unfortunate, the domination of the representative agent, we really had everything represented as one individual. So the whole world was basically one individual. Now we don't have that anymore. So in that sense, in my area, I'm quite optimistic. But for the rest, I don't know it well. And last point, I think there was a preponderance in economics of studies which really basically are business-like studies. These are studies that are really being done on the financial sector because the financial sector has the money. They want to study these things to make money on the stock market. So basically, financial economics has kind of invaded economics. And when you look at the percentage of people whose incomes depend on that, it's relatively small because of the concentration of assets in the hands of the few. So I think that's an unfortunate development.
That's kind of an answer to my last question on this section, which was in the last 3 or 4 decades, we have overemphasized the role of economists as experts. For some, their technical skills explain how countries perform, not just their economies, but also socially and politically sometimes. So my question was, and I don't know if you want to expand on this, what are the limits of economists as experts, and what is their role in modern capitalism?
Obviously, since I'm an economist, I'm in favor of the economist. But I think what has happened is that the economics has moved, and I think it really basically goes back, in my opinion, to Samuelson. It has moved more and more from being a social science to being something which pretends to be some kind of a neutral, all-knowing science. And, you should just look, for example, at Samuelson's papers. He ostensibly calls them in a book, scientific papers. Nobody called it, like that, because it's a social science. We do the work which is similar to, historians, political scientists, others. It is a science, but it's actually not physics. And we have, and or at least classical physics, because I understand the current physics are different from the classical physics. So I think we have moved in that direction, and because of the power of money, which I think is was linked, as I was saying before, with the financial sector, we have actually, economists have become really rich. They've been very well paid. They're doing consultancies that bring millions. You have seen probably the movie, Inside the Job, which really so blatantly shows that essentially they're being paid to tell the story that they need. You remember this guy for the Icelandic banks? He wrote a great report how stable their Icelandic banks. They then collapsed, and then he changed the title from stability of the Icelandic banking system to instability of Icelandic banking system. So we have become, the economists have become very powerful because, of course, the interests are there that support them, and this is the role they have played. They have a little bit played like courts. What is this called? Like court jesters. There is a big court. That court is like financial. Powerful organization, investment banks, other banks, and so on, and they are the closest to them, and they actually derive money and power from that. So I think that's unfortunate because it has left, and I believe this is aside, one of the areas that I think is totally left out, which is crucial, is economic history, and this is really something that it's not valued as much as it should be, and that really is the real economics that we used to think of and actually like in the past, because it links history, social development, sociology, even anthropology, and economics.
That's great. Let's move now to our last section, which is more about politics and the left. So these last 2 years, we have seen an increasing, or even more, but we have seen an increasing political polarization in many Western countries. The Gilets jaunes in France, the emergence of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, the increasing importance even of Bernie Sanders and Podemos, social uprisings in the Andean countries, especially in Ecuador and Chile. So you have argued that the world has turned, globally speaking, less unequal. However, you have also noted that inequalities have increased in the West. What is the relation between this increasing inequality in the West and political polarization? And what are the risks here?
Yeah, I think that there is, little doubt that that increased inequality and certainly the stagnation of middle-class incomes had to do with polarization. We see that actually very, clearly in current elections. People were, dismissing Trump, but the fact that you get 60 million votes, it's like not nothing, And I think that actually, even when you look at where the votes come from, they come from disaffected people, and many of them are actually disaffected because they saw the top 1% or top 10% really becoming richer and richer, and having something which I actually called in one of my blogs, this articulation goes north, because basically there is what US now has, and also some countries like France, this articulation of the 1970s that people were writing about. You have a top class which is very well integrated with globalization, the rest of the world, and which really doesn't care much about the hinterland. So really in the US, it's really a struggle between the top class and the hinterland now, and as you can see, they're almost the same. So I think this is the result of higher inequality, globalization, lack of interest in what happened to the middle class. Now, the solutions are, of course, more difficult. I suppose you're going to ask me about that. So they're not so obvious, but I think that there are some policies that the left can follow to actually and not let be sort of driven by the right wing or by plutocratic, or what is called pluto-populists of the Trump kind.
Yes, actually, I'm going that way now. So I have two remaining questions. The first one is, how can we reconcile this increasing global reduction of inequality with a world of fragmented sovereignties in which politicians need to win elections addressing their own constituencies?
You will have to clarify it a little bit for me, but let me say the reduction of global inequality is essentially the product of the rise of Asia, not only of China, but of course India, Indonesia, and so on. And to some extent, it's a mirror image of what happened during the first industrial revolution, where of course inequality increased because the West became so much richer than the rest and pushed inequality up. And throughout the whole 19th century, inequality was kind of rising the whole time. Now we really have like a mirror image, the rise of Asia, which of course starts with very low level of income and becomes richer, is now reducing inequality. So this was, and of course, I think what you also asked was that actually the power of individual states in the globalized world has diminished. Simply, for example, you look at capital. Capital is much more mobile. You cannot stop it the way that you've been able to do it in the past. Capital can actually control labor at distance, which in the past could not do that. So you basically really have much less of a control. Now, remind me maybe of the exact question, because I was not quite sure.
I'll actually move to the last question, which is super related, because in a recent short piece, you said that the left should not aim to recover this kind of lost paradise of the Bretton Woods years, and should instead bet for a new strand of internationalism that provides a different, if you want, fairer kind of globalization. Do you think that's possible? How can the left compete against these new nativists like Trump or Bolsonaro, who have a very compelling narratives for the losers of globalization? That's my point. How do you reconcile this global economy with fragmented sovereignties?
This is a very difficult question. Let me start trying to answer actually, because I will not be able to answer it fully, but in a negative sense. What I actually believe is that this pining for the lost world of what we discussed in the beginning of the, what was called the, great compression of inequality, or the 30 years or the golden age. I think it's wrong, because the conditions are entirely different today. I don't need to explain, but I think it's very clear that that world cannot be conjured up again. So many of the left-wing people actually are now basically in favor of stopping migration, of trying to limit outflow of capital, which is difficult, of really sort of turning back globalization, which actually would reduce global incomes. So I think these are really kind of how should I call it, reactionary measures even. So we don't want the left to become really sort of anti-internationalist in order to recapture 1960s. So I'm against that. But now, of course, it is much more difficult to say what will be a positive program of the left, which would go against, as you said, the compelling narratives that Bolsonaro or Trump or Farage or others have. And I think it is much more difficult. And I think the basic difficulty there is that the left has been very comfortable for historical reasons to work within the nation state, but now, and to proclaim its sort of solidarity with the others. But now you have the poor people who want to move there into that, welfare state, and then undermine the position of the workers or, laborers, domestic laborers. So there is really a conflict here. Whom do you represent, and how you can reconcile these two things? One of the points in my current book and the previous one was about this migration approach, which would actually try to find some kind of middle solution between allowing foreign migrants into the country, but not giving them a straight path to citizenship, so that actually that would reduce the opposition of the right wing, presumably, to foreign labor, so that actually they would see them as a temporary measure. Whether it is realistic, I don't know, but it is, at least we should really consider something which I called also different graduated citizenship, so that actually you have different layers of citizenship. So, okay, to answer the question, it is difficult. I think actually in the case of the United States that I know the best, it is not, maybe because I know it better, it is not so impossible to do that, because what you would need to do, and that's actually why my recommendations at the end of the book are very short. You need deconcentration of capital ownership, which cannot be done in one day, but you can have many of the advantages that are now enjoyed only by large owners of assets to be really given to people with very modest assets, including tax deductions or lower tax rates if you're really a small investor. Employee stock ownership plans which can actually be linked to lower corporate taxation if you have more workers involved in your company as shareholders. So it can be done. The second part is really breaking this lock of high, extremely expensive education on maintaining on reproduction of this social inequality. So that can be done by improving tremendously and by giving much more money to public schools and actually taxing private schools and their endowments. So that can be done as well. And then finally, you have things which deal with labor, which is increased the minimum wage, which many cities have already done and states have done in the US, with reintroducing actually much stronger workers' rights, including trade union rights and so on. So you can do that, and I think these are all the measures that would be actually also appealing to the middle class. I'm not sure that you can do everything, because there will be still an outflow of jobs simply because the forces of globalization are very strong. If I can hire somebody in Laos at 1/10 of the wage in the US, how am I not going to do that? So, that's true that actually you will not solve everything, but I think that you would solve some of the problems, and gradually with, of course, that generation that is now being affected, getting older and having access to social security and other things, they would basically be, allowed to live reasonable lives, and then their children would not remain, as there is a danger now, part of a sort of a underclass, because we had in the US, black underclass. Now we are actually in the danger of creating a white underclass. And I think that is, a real danger in the future, that you would have really now people who will have had like 3 generations of people without sufficient education, no steady jobs, and you cannot expect that they should be really happy with the regime as it is.
If I have time to add just one more question, I was wondering, not what would you like, but what do you think is going to happen? Are we seeing in the near future a reversal of this globalization process, or that's not possible? What do you think?
I don't think so. Of course, many people now talk with Corona. There will be some reversal in the sense that people have realized that some of these assumptions about, global value chains have to be revised a little bit. The world is not going to function like you have drawn that on your map and assume there are no external shocks. Corona was a huge external shock. So I think there will be some of them, and maybe even the issue of China-US relations, although we have seen remarkably lately, actually, investments in China have been actually very higher than before, because China has now recovered much faster than anybody else. But I think that the underlying forces, which I mentioned in the last answer, are so overwhelming. It's like telling me, do you want to make, $5 or $500? Well, everybody wants to make $500. So people would do that. I mean, if the difference in wages that you have to pay here in the rich countries compared to difference in wages in Asia or Africa are so large, you would have these underlying forces which would really militate in favor of globalization. And this is something that I cannot see ending unless, and that would come in the future, there will be a convergence of incomes between the countries. Then when there is a convergence of incomes between countries, then the advantage of cheap labor elsewhere disappears. And then, of course, the situation would change. But that's going to be a long time, because now the advantages of equally skilled cheap labor in Ethiopia or Laos or Burma, or you take any other country, are so overwhelming And our ability, even now what we are doing now, shows our ability to communicate at distance, and it shows our ability to control the labor or production process at distance. So if I'm actually able to talk to you at distance, I'm also able to see by the company how it produces and how it works. And
so you're not seeing, you're not seeing any scenario similar to the collapse of the first globalization.
No, I honestly cannot see it. I think that technologically we have gone much further. Now, if we end up in a nuclear war, then, yeah, we might actually, well, obviously we will see the end, but there will be the end of many things.
Okay, so Professor Milanović, thank you very much for this interview, for your time. This has been a super interesting conversation, and I hope that the readers and the audience of Jacobin will enjoy it. So thank you very much.
Pablo, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. I really appreciated your questions that were excellent and that allowed me maybe to expand on some of the themes that I wish I spent more time, or maybe others can actually spend more time from Capitalism alone.